So next up, with some really good news, is John Wick. And John is a rancher. He's the co-owner with his wife Peggy Rathman of the Nicasio Native Grass Ranch. And John is also the co-founder of the Marin Carbon Project and serves as its tireless spokesperson and advisor as it moves from research to implementation. The Marin Carbon Project is a collaboration among scientists, government agencies, nonprofits, and ranchers who are working together to determine how to best maximize carbon sequestration in soils and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So John is here with lots of good news of what's being discovered and what's being done. Welcome, John. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
This is going to take me just a moment to set up and turn on my equipment here. I didn't know, were there some questions?
Yeah, if you guys have a few questions maybe for John while he gets this set up.
How do you deal with the yuck factor as the IJ was so quick to point out?
I personally don't deal with it.
For the rest of the people who might need to.
Okay. Great question. How do I deal with the yuck factor? We'll get to.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen out there, come on into the inside stage where you can hear our keynote speaker, John Wicks, from the Marin Carbon Project. Inside stage, John Wicks.
We have you and all your clones, all the John Wicks. John Wick. So you were just about to address the gentleman's question about the yuck factor of compost.
I'm going to, 1 second, I want to do one thing here. If we get a white screen, we're up and running. This is great news. The yuck factor. So my remarks today were actually going to focus on soil carbon sequestration through the application of compost, but the question that was raised was about composting human waste, which is a project that we've started as a consequence of having experienced tremendous success applying compost. So we're now looking at other feedstocks available to put on soil systems to ignite a state change to reverse global warming. Human waste has tremendous potential as a underutilized resource. We see human waste as value-added nutrients. And so in terms of the yuck factor, there are two halves to our project. One of them is the collection of human waste, which we're dealing with technologically in terms of a range of toilets that we're experimenting with, a vacuum-based one and a foam flush toilet. And once we've collected that material, from then on it's containerized and we can put it into a compost project where there isn't any odor associated with it. And that was a big surprise to us. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you. He had a question first, but.
My question has to do with, I'm someone I consider myself to be wasting energy, which I don't want to do it. And so my question has to do with precisely this. I'm an apartment renter.
You know, I'm having a really hard time hearing you.
I'm an apartment renter. I have a flat roof.
Okay, you have a flat roof.
Neighbor who uses a barbecue almost every day. Therefore, I have been forced to install a refrigerated air conditioning unit. A refrigerated air conditioning unit, something I never thought I would have an inner disgust in having to buy. But when I mentioned to him one day about his barbecue, his attitude seemed to be anything but welcoming. I found out from a neighbor who works for the county that when she brought it up to him, wound up with a police call, and he moved it. The police came after the move it. He moved it exactly 6 feet. He got a really big piece of land. So my question is there any?
I don't think I heard a question.
Yeah, so is your question about the, I'm not
Tell you what I'd like to do, I have a presentation that may inform the way you think, and then we would have a conversation after that, which I'd welcome. And there was one other question here.
Just to follow up on the human waste thing, which I think is a fabulous idea. What happens to chemicals that have been applied, like
Pharmaceuticals, okay, so great question. So the project that we're discussing right now is called the Thermopile Project, and we have a website, Thermopile, for thermophilic pile of compost, thermopileproject.org. I would encourage all of you to look at it. And we had to address the question of whether we could compost human waste in a sequence. The first thing we needed to address were pathogens. So we'll go on the website and you'll see the results. We absolutely destroyed pathogens within just a few days. And that was a big success. We now know how to safely handle human waste through thermophilic composting to produce a very stable carbon-nitrogen complex. That now supports the next round of research, which is to look at pharmaceuticals, hormones, compounds of emerging concern, and such, which we are organizing to do right now. And we're very confident that we will destroy those because of the high temperatures we got. I'm very confident. It's a very exciting thing. So let me back up just one click. My name is John Wick, and I'm the co-founder of the Marin Carbon Project with Dr. Jeff Creek. And that's a very important relationship because I'm a rancher, and Jeff Creek is an ecosystem scientist. He has a PhD in rangeland ecology. And through that relationship, I've experienced a tremendous insight into these managed systems. Our ranch is out in West Marin, and through his advice, we were using grazing management not for the production of milk or meat or wool, but rather as an event for the benefit of the ecosystem. And we did this for several years, where we timed when in the year we brought on a borrowed herd of cattle. I don't own any animals, but what I do is grow grass. And borrowing this herd of cattle allowed me to introduce them into our ecosystem when the grass was at peak nutrition, and then send them away. I also was waiting for the annual oats, the exotic oats that dominate our system, to come into flower, and then introduce the grazing event. The cows eat down the oats, which then allows sunlight to get at the perennial system. And after several years of that, we started to see populations of native perennial grasses appearing without planting any seeds. So grazing alone had started to shift our whole ecosystem towards a native perennial system. And this was a very exciting event. And all the while, Dr. Jeff Creek was describing that what he thought we in fact were doing was shipping carbon from the atmosphere photosynthetically through the plants, and some of it was going into the soil system. And that's what I'm here to talk to you guys about today. In 1997, gotta get my calendar right here. 2007, the decades go by fast, you'll find that out later on. But in November of 2007, we were very confident that what we were doing was moving carbon, but we didn't know of a measurement protocol. And so we were put in a position to go to UC Berkeley and talk to a group of scientists and ask the question, was my grazing management enhancing soil carbon? And of that whole group of scientists at UC Berkeley, Dr. Wendy Silver stood up. Now Wendy is a biogeochemist and is a world-recognized soil carbon sequestration expert. And in 2007, November, she said, I doubt it. I doubt you could measure it. And if we look at it scientifically, you won't like the results. And this is a very important beginning of a relationship with a scientist. She's skeptical. Now, Jeff Creek had been measuring increases of soil organic matter on the McAvoy olive plantation, where he'd been using grazing management and compost application for a decade. And he'd been measuring increases of soil organic matter, half of which is carbon. Jeff's experience gave me the courage to proceed with the research. So we organized a series of surveys in Marin and Sonoma to a meter deep on 35 dairy pastures and beef pastures to get a baseline of soil carbon levels. And we found out some amazing things. But before we go into those level of details, I want to show you the basic mechanism of carbon transfer it's kind of at the root of this whole discussion. And I think this should work here. I'm going to draw, and let me know if it comes out on the screen behind me here. So that the subject worked. That's cool. Okay, so as a rancher, what I mostly interact with is sun, air, soil, and water. And it's my job to work with these elements to grow grass. And so what I've come to appreciate is that these little grass plants actually are straws that sip carbon from the atmosphere. And I'd like to describe what that means. Grass plants are different than trees in terms of carbon because grass plants allocate more carbon below ground than trees do. Grasslands and grass plants develop deep roots, particularly perennial plants. And so California in the 1500s experienced a population of oats that came with the Spanish and their cows. And starting in 1524, California became covered with annual oats. It's not the native plant from here, but it puts all its energy into above ground biomass production to grow seeds. And it does that. It does it really well. Not being from here, it actually outcompetes the native perennials. So my grazing strategy, where we have a deep-rooted perennial plant like this, for instance, and where next to it might be a oat plant, which is just making seeds, and then dying and drying and crowding out sunlight from the perennial plants. As a grazing manager, if I can wait for the oat plant to go to flower, and then bring cows on, they'll eat all of those, and then that allows sunshine to get to the growth crowns of the perennial plants. And that was our strategy, and it worked. All the while that we were doing that, let's see if my little techniques work here. No, not quite. So in that process of grazing management to promote native perennial grasses, Dr. Creek kept saying these are like straws sipping carbon from the atmosphere. And so to understand what he was describing, what I learned in school, and I went to Drake, not Redwood, so it feels kind of weird being in this gym, but somewhat familiar too. What I learned was that grass and all green plants actually produce oxygen and moisture to the atmosphere. And this is a really good thing and really important. But what I didn't know until this project was that air has CO2, and we currently have a lot of it. Atmospheric CO2 is a gas, and as a gas, it fills whatever vessel it's in. The atmosphere is a vessel. So when the stomata open on the grass plants to release the oxygen and moisture, CO2, as a gas under pressure, rushes in and fills the leaf. And then the sun-powered photosynthetic process allows the plant to pull soil moisture and soil nutrients or minerals in through small hairs on the roots. Can you guys see this okay? Is that working? Yeah. Right on. So we have a leaf filled with carbon in the form of CO2. Then the plant starts pulling in soil moisture, soil nutrients, and recombines all of those as carbohydrates, sugars. And this is pretty cool. I didn't know till this project, but all of the carbon and carbohydrates comes out of the air and nowhere else. I'd always assumed it came in up through the roots. So this is really significant, and now I'm starting to understand what Dr. Creek is suggesting. Our management of this grassland system is taking carbon from the air, converting it into carbohydrates, and he was of the mind that some of that carbon was ending up in the soil system. So when we met with Dr. Wendy Silver at UC Berkeley, she said, well, I doubt it, I doubt you could measure it. And she said, but before we go any further, it's really important that people understand soil carbon. Soil carbon is actually on a continuum. Most soil carbon is in a fraction, the labile fraction. Most of this carbon is temporary. It's in the bodies of microorganisms and in plants, and most of it is going back to the air as CO2. This is the natural result of soil processes. Everything is looking for food, eating, living, exhaling, and we see a tremendous amount of CO2 going back to the atmosphere from natural soil processes. So that's actually a carbon cycle. We have atmospheric CO2 come in through plants, become part of the plant, become part of the soil system as microorganisms and plant roots, be oxidized and go back to the atmosphere, restoring the resource from which this all happens. Our question was, in that process, is some of that carbon ending up in the soil? Dr. Silver said the labile fraction is very temporary, most carbon's in that form, but through soil processes, microorganisms eating other microorganisms, some of that carbon starts to go towards permanent. This is the occluded light fraction. And this is interesting carbon now because a few things happen here. This is no longer in the bodies of microorganisms, but this is the waste product of the combustion or consumption process of organisms. And this is becoming physically protected in the soil structure. We think of it as humus. And when that happens, a really good thing happens. It changes the electrical properties of the soil system. And now rainwater that was subject to gravity and passing through that system actually becomes detained. and it becomes like a vapor around this electrically charged soil, becoming plant available. This is really important. Increases of soil carbon in the occluded light fraction automatically enhance soil water holding capacity. And then after more processes, some of that carbon now being consumed by microorganisms enters the heavy fraction. And this is really interesting carbon because this carbon now is physically and chemically protected inside the soil structure, unavailable for microorganisms, and is permanent. And likewise, it changes the electrical characteristics of the soil system. So heavy fraction carbon can last for the millennia. Occluded light fraction carbon might last for decades. Labile carbon is temporary, most of it going back to the atmosphere. And that's the whole range of soil carbon. So entering that system now, we're looking at potentially increasing soil carbon through grazing management. Dr. Silver suggested we weren't doing it and couldn't measure it. But we went ahead and looked at it, and to get a baseline, before we were going to see if we could add carbon, we needed to know what we were starting with. We looked at 35 sites in Marin, Sonoma to a meter deep, and we found something amazing that surprised even her. We found 30 to 150 tons of carbon per hectare. And now with the scientists involved, we're dealing with 2.5 acre units, hectares. So we see a range of carbon from 150 down to 30 tons. Dr. Silver wanted to know what had happened on these high carbon sites, and this became interesting. We went back and looked at the history of them, and we found that all of those sites had had wet dairy manure applied as a disposal solution. The farmers do this to get rid of their manure, and they get a response in the biomass. They see an increased grass growth over a period of time. We know that manure application on rangelands has some downsides, so it's probably not our best strategy. There's eutrophication of waterways, there's greenhouse gas emissions, there's pathogens, things like that. But based on that, we now are thinking that perhaps a management practice was increasing soil carbon. We then sent that soil to the lab and had it carbon dated, and this is really important, and there's a paper coming out just on this. We found heavy fraction permanent carbon that was measurable and less than a decade old. We know that because of the nuclear testing that the French did. We found 10-year-old or less carbon a meter deep in the soil that was permanent. This was really important, and it was a significant enough finding that we could design a whole set of experiments on it. And what that looked like then, rather than wet dairy manure, Dr. Jeff Krieg suggested that what we do is use compost. And this is just a thought exercise. It was not our intention to put compost on rangelands, but we thought, well, if we want to see if we can add carbon, let's add carbon. Now, we wanted to topically apply it and not integrate it. It was very important to just lay a dusting of compost. So on December 8th, 2008, we did a set of experiments on my ranch and up at the Sierra Foothill Research Extension Center, where we took 25 meter by 65 meter randomly assigned treatment and control plots. We had a buffer between them, and then we replicated all of them 3 times. So we basically had triple replicates of randomly assigned treatment and control plots on my ranch and in the Sierras. By doing that, we bracketed California's Mediterranean rangeland system. We had a coastal prairie system and a Sierra Foothill system, which are the boundaries of that system. We had different soil systems, different grass, different climate, different grazing management. We hauled the exact same compost from Sacramento to both directions. And we did a complete above-ground biomass mapping. Dr. Val Ebner from UC Davis has just published a paper on that. We did a complete biogeochemical analysis of the soil system. We took weekly readings with an infrared gas analyzer measuring soil respiration. We knew how much CO2 was leaving the system. So we knew how much carbon was in the soil. We knew how much carbon was in the compost. We knew how much carbon was leaving the system. And we dusted these treatment plots on December 8th, 2008 on my ranch, December 12th in the Sierras. Prior to that, we'd installed full-time sensors measuring soil temperature and soil moisture to 30 centimeters. And we did 9 soil samples before and after every grazing event and treatment to a meter deep. We pretty much understood the system. We put the compost out, and by May, both systems had been grazed, and then we came back in and measured the results. Right away, what we measured was a 50% increase of forage production. This is a lot more grass. That's basically $350 a year hay per hectare that a rancher would not have to buy. And then for the water, having the water sensors in there, we measured something amazing. We measured 26,000 liters more water per hectare compared to the control. This alone is worth doing. And then, looking at the biogeochemistry, going into the occluded light fraction and heavy fraction, we measured our carbon consequences. And what we saw was great. We measured 2,000 more pounds of carbon per hectare than the control. This was confusing at first because it turns out the controls are actually losing carbon. And that's another conversation I'd be happy to have afterwards. But there are 4 things happening right now in these systems that have caused rangeland systems to become a source of greenhouse gas emissions. And this is really bad news because rangeland systems are the single largest cover type on Earth. There are more acres of rangeland than any other cover type, more than forest or urban or arable land systems. And because of changes in climate, grass type, grazing management, we've now entered a system that's crashing. And so on December 8th, with a simple bump of a half-inch of compost, we knocked the system and it started going the other direction. And we have several peer-reviewed published papers about this and the full LCA. And I would think it was a pretty big success at that point. We were very happy with the results. Then the decision was whether we should apply another coating of compost on the treatment plots. And we decided not to. We decided to let it run out and see if it went away or what happened. And I'm glad we did that because the next year, with no further compost, another 2,000 pounds came in on its own. And then the next year, another 2,000 pounds came in on its own. And then the next year, another 2,000. We're on our 6th year now, entering our 7th. Every year since, with no further compost, we've seen a ton of atmospheric carbon coming through plants, ending up in the heavy fractions. It's pretty cool, huh? So I'm very pleased. When we gave this data set to Dr. Bill Parkin at Colorado State University, the author of the Century Biogeochemical Model, he ran the numbers and he said that this will continue for 30 years, if not 100, from a single application of a half-inch of compost. He also suggested that a quarter-inch would do the same thing. And so I'll speak to that in a minute. We've actually expanded our research. We're out at scale now. We're comparing quarter-inch and half-inch side by side. But this was pretty cool, I would say. And so then Dr. Marcia DeLonge from UC Berkeley did the full life cycle assessment. We had to measure the collection of the materials that was heading to a landfill. We had to measure the composting process, the fuel used in all of this, the transportation, the distribution, the internal fermentation of the cattle grazing, the background signature of respiration from soil systems, and everything else you could think of. And it was an amazing outcome. She measured 38 tons of avoided emissions per hectare by taking that material out of landfills. So 38 tons of avoided emissions, 30 years of a ton a year going in per hectare from a single application of compost. This is an order of magnitude higher than any other conversations happening right now. This is a massive quantity of carbon. Okay, so the question is the 38 tons over the project length? The 38 tons occurs one time from diverting those materials from becoming a greenhouse gas source. So, but
How does this compare now to the nitrogen levels? Because the ammonia evidently is more toxic for our atmosphere, right, than the carbon.
I think CO2 is actually our bigger problem. And I could direct you to the scientists. Yeah, so the question is about ammonia. Now, the composting process actually has a negative consequence. It creates volatile organic carbons and ammonia. Those are the two reasons why the ARB, the Air Resources Board, is not advocating compost projects. But our data shows solidly that those small amount of emissions, which we've accounted for fully here and have a peer-reviewed published paper, are so small compared to the benefit that we say that the compost process, when that compost goes in this system, is justified. Did that answer your question or not?
Oh, just hold on a second there. So do you want to take some questions now? Or
If it's helpful,
do you want to
I'm very
finish?
flexible. There's a lot more to go. How are we?
Oh, okay. So,
Oh, we're running out.
oh,
We're gonna go, folks. I didn't mean to
What?
interrupt. We're gonna go past 5 o'clock. We'll let John know, complete his presentation. So we won't wrap up right at 5. So we'll let it continue.
Yeah, and we could talk in detail about that. And it's a great question, and these are the great questions that we've addressed. The good news is, yes, we won. It worked.
Oh, yeah, so when you're ready for questions, let me know.
Well, yeah.
I'll look down first and we'll get the mic.
I think the questions are in context. So
Well, that's what I do too, then if people raise their hands, because sometimes when you're doing something that's complex like this, someone might need a question.
I'm there. Yeah, please.
Yeah.
A clarifying question? Or?
Clarifying is okay. So there's certain, I mean, there's a whole lot of ammonia that's being produced by all these out in the world, as we know. And I'm just wondering, so
Well,
if you
that's a very big statement. No, everything's on a continuum. So contained animal feeding operation or free range.
Well, what I'm wondering is how, I mean, if all this manure were being composted, sounds like you'd be breaking down a lot of the ammonia.
Yes.
That's all I was wondering.
Yeah, it's my ambition to compost anything that was ever alive, globally. Just a small statement. You had a question too, or?
Hold on, let me get the mic for you.
Well, I thought I saw your hand go. Oh. So basically, you guys get the general idea here. We tested the idea. We put a little bit of carbon out, and the soil system knew exactly what to do with it. It was a topical application of a biologically stable carbon-nitrogen complex, and that's what compost is. And soil systems basically have all of the things they need except carbon to do this. And by putting compost out on grazed rangeland, we actually could remove enough carbon from the atmosphere and put it beneficially into our food and fiber producing soils to reverse global warming. It seems like a win on every level. I'm pretty excited about it. We have several peer-reviewed published papers, we have the full peer-reviewed published life cycle assessment, and we have the protocol that the Environmental Defense Fund was given a SIG grant. It's a Conservation Innovation Grant from the USDA for this particular practice to be approved as a methodology to mitigate greenhouse gases and perhaps provide an income stream to land managers to do this additional work. It is additional work. Putting compost out, it takes work and fuel. So it's not a gimme that people would just do this. I think the forage production and the water holding capacity are reason enough to do it, and we'll see if that plays out. I'm not sure how much further to go.
I think hold on.
As a fellow rancher, another question is that the role of the water plants, both in the compost,
I missed
the
it.
role of the water plants. In order to get the compost, what I said was the role of water plants.
Oh, the role of water.
So
Yeah.
in order to get the compost nutrients to be absorbed, given our climate, how the timing of the application,
Great question.
and then with the forage production as well. The benefits over time certainly, because of the water retention, are beneficial, but initially, is additional water needed, or is it applied when it's going to rain?
Yeah, great question.
Sufficient?
So in our region here in California, the best time to apply an organic amendment like compost is just before the rains. So we try and hit all our compost application before October 15th. This year, it didn't rain and didn't rain and didn't rain, but we have our compost out by then. And then the water, what was the other half of that?
He was asking about the role that water plays, and is that what you meant?
Yeah.
For forage production, the amount of water that's necessary. So if you have 50% increase in growth, you also need additional water. So the importance again of the water cycle, they have sufficient water to provide for that production.
Yeah, so we had the benefit of this experiment occurring in California's driest season and wettest within the 4 years that we were doing this. And we saw the important role of water in that. But I was out on my ranch in the middle of last summer in the drought, and 6 years later, you can go out and I had green grass all summer. And you can touch the soil and it's moist. And the control plot was bone dry next to it.
So it's not only just sequestering carbon, it's also
holding
ground
water.
energy.
Exactly. It's really exciting what happened in terms of the water function. Now, my particular grazing management, and by doing that, now I have a deeper rooted plant that can take advantage of late season rain events. So even though the system's out of whack in terms of weather, I still have plant growth year round. So, there are strategies that are very easy to do. I say that it was the hardest I've ever worked. But it's simple work. It's just good work is what it is. And so by promoting native perennials, which we have scientific data now showing perennial grasses actually transfer more carbon below ground than annuals. So by steering towards a carbon beneficial plant through grazing management, enhancing the carbon cycle just by that one-time use of our waste streams, we can realize this ongoing soil carbon sequestration.
And, I just have a quick question, and then I second that one. But also the import or the impact of the grazing that you need, that this has to do with the grazing
Yeah.
and animals, so basically properly grazed pasture lands sequester more carbon than, say, a forest.
Well, any grassland potentially sequesters more carbon than a forest, and it sequesters it below ground where it's safe from wildfire and forest fires. Grasslands transfer more carbon below ground than forest systems. We entered that, we know that. But grazing management's a wonderfully exciting conversation. Grazing management ranges from overgrazing to undergrazing. And so what's the optimal grazing to achieve what outcome? I've got 4 years of data now where I've tried to sequester carbon in the soil just by grazing management, and I have not yet been able to do it. So a variety of different grazing densities and durations and when in the year I'm doing it, I'm not seeing carbon transfer, and for the first time in 4 years we found a biomass response in 4 out of 6 research plots. So the grazing management, I will get there, I'm not there yet. Compost clearly ignites the state change, so we can start the thing by that. And it's important to know globally, soil systems have lost most of their carbon through our management. And this is a 10,000 year trend. So we're restoring carbon. We're not adding something that wasn't there historically. Very important now, a lot of the concerns around this research were, if we put compost on rangelands, are we going to increase weeds? That was a very legitimate question. The plant paper came out last week. No weed increase. In fact, we saw a reduction of medusa head in the Sierra site. So that was really good news. And that might be in part because the systems are grazed. The cows like those annual plants and go right through them. But that's part of our strategy. Now remember, rangeland systems are the largest cover type on Earth, and most of them are grazed. And grazing management accounts for a huge amount of human occupation on the planet. So we're stepping into an intact system where just perhaps a small change in management could have these results.
That, what you're talking about kind of leads into what I was thinking of, which is maybe, the whole problem with Roundup and the glyphosates that are being used everywhere and the toxicity to our water and our land. So have you been dealing with that at any level? Have you seen that change any of the dynamics or I don't know.
So glyphosates the danger of a glyphosate type product is it bioaccumulates. It doesn't break down and then it starts concentrating the more and more you compost the materials that might have it in it. And if you take a compost that has Roundup or something like that in it, that's glyphosate, right?
Yes.
Actually, I'm misspeaking here. It's the broadleaf herbicides like Transline and Milestone that I have understanding about. Those ones are the bioaccumulators. I don't know the glyphosate. I expect it's not good. It also bioaccumulates. Yeah.
So if you find that it's doing levels of sterility in the soil and other pathogens or in that environment coming forward, it's just destructive. But you talked earlier about in the composting, especially of human waste, but the composting processes frequently clean things up. And so maybe you could address that a little bit.
Yeah.
You've been wondering, like, what if you had something you were composting that had come from where there was glyphosate, or when you were talking about with human manure that you were able to, or human waste, to get rid of.
I don't know what's going to happen with glyphosate, so that's a challenge, and we'll have to figure that one out.
But the magic of compost sometimes
so
does things up.
let's talk about compost. I thought compost was a natural thing. It's not. I don't think you could go out in the woods and find a big pile of compost naturally occurring. Thermophilic bacteria is probably the oldest life form on Earth. It's everywhere. It's in the air. It's on every surface. And when you create the ideal conditions of air, moisture, carbon, and nitrogen, thermophilic bacteria populate that pile. And in doing so, they develop tremendous heat. It's an exponential increase of population that gets really hot. We measured 181 degrees Fahrenheit after just several days when we built our larger piles. And after the thermophilic bacteria digest all that material, Then mesophilic and cryophilic, and then earthworms come in. So the materials that you've assembled go through a series of biological processes, during which temperature and then biophagic and then mycophagic procedure or processes. The fungus breaks down all the wood particles and things like that. It takes time. And so the composting process, when you manage for it, you can destroy pathogens. We clearly have documented that. And likewise, we can start deactivating these compounds and chemicals. That's further research that we're engaged in right now. Does that some background on composting?
Yeah.
And so in nature, there's rot, there's decomposition. Composting is different. Rot releases greenhouse gases. Composting is actually taking a lot of those out of the air in terms of not releasing them to begin with.
So John, could you give us a little bit of kind of, it sounds like what the future is, where you're going. You've come from this amazing place of, I don't think so, from Winnie Silver to amazing results. So it sounds like you're looking more towards the composting processes and
we're looking at everything. We're looking at economics around this. We're looking at policy support and what regulations might be a problem. And so far, there are a couple tensions around. Most people don't realize this, but there will be no more organics in landfills in California by 2016. This is happening, whether we're watching or not. The Cal Recycle is in charge of making that happen. But at the same time, the Air Resources Board is trying to shut down compost operations because of the ammonious and volatile organic carbons. So there's a little tension there that we need to work with. The economics around doing that, the price point for putting the tonnage out to do this, it was pricey. Most land managers won't do it, but if there's increased forage production and extended growing season and carbon market mechanisms, that might make it work there. And so just to kind of summarize where we're at, we did a proof of concept starting in 2008. We did a very solid research project, which then expanded out onto 3 other dairies to see what it would look like on other working landscapes with different grazing management. So we went on the Point Reyes Blue Cheese Dairy, the La Franchi Nicastro Cheese Dairy, and the Bivalve Dairy in Point Reyes Station. So we had 3 different grazing managements. We had the opportunity to expand it. We compared compost with 2 different carbon nitrogen ratios with a manure, replicated 3 times, and then we replicated that 3 times, and we're getting the same results. Those 3 dairies have different grazing management entirely. One leaves cows on the land 365 days a year, one brings them on for 6 months only, and one brings them on for 2 weeks. Similar results. So the grazing management isn't a big thing. Different soils, different grasses, different everything. It's the compost that did it. So that allowed us now to apply for a conservation innovation grant from the USDA, and we've now gone at scale on 3 ranches in Marin, the Strauss Dairy, the Corda Dairy, and Stemple Creek. We put thousands of yards of compost out last fall, and we're now taking it to scale. We've identified that the compost is readily available. It was easy to apply. The landowner wanted to do it. As carbon market protocols kick in by this summer, we could have conversations about perhaps some carbon credit money coming in some version. I'm not sure what that'll look like yet. So very, very exciting.
And so maybe we can get rid of meatless Mondays and have it be a grass-fed, properly grazed,
It could do. But if you don't want to eat them, you could also just enjoy the wool. The important thing is they're out there participating with these natural systems. And I'd heard recently that in America, the standing population of deer, which we know, was about 5 million head for the last, a million years. And now it's over 100 million head. So there are a lot of grazing animals out there not being managed that also are eating grasses and participating in this, whether we're watching or not.
We're going to have to wrap up. John,
Thank you guys so much.
Can you let everybody know a website or where they can find out more, keep up with what you're doing?
Yeah, there's two important ones. One is the Marin, it's marincarbonproject.org. And then the other one is carboncycleinstitute.org. And that's an overarching organization that we created to do the thermopile research, the carbon project, the fiber shed, and all the related activities. But thank you guys very much.
John, thank you so much. The curiosity along the way, and the faith and depth, and all the work you guys are doing.
My pleasure.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending today, this year's birthday. I want to thank food writer and KWR personality Robin Carpenter, who is our MC, Hannah the rest, who produces the event, does a great job. And we also have Hank Reinhold for being here today. Thanks everyone for attending. Drive safely, all.